Welcome, Crater fans. This is a talk from Crater Remote Conf Mobile Edition. This talk focuses on building mobile apps using JavaScript. You can find out more information about upcoming Crater Remote Confs at conf.crater.io. Enjoy the talk. The second talk is from Scott Tolinski of Level Up Tutorials. He actually has a React Native course, so if you're interested in spending some time learning some React Native, I would highly recommend going over to Level Up Tutorials and checking that out. So welcome, Scott.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, good. Scott does not have a webcam, so when we do the Q&A part, you won't be able to see him, but he does have shared, and I think we're ready to go. So take it away, Scott.
Hey, so my name is Scott Tolinski. I created Level Up Tutorials in 2012, just doing a whole bunch of free tutorials on YouTube. So, and it's grown and grown, and by now I have like 900 some free tutorials, of which it's topics from JavaScript stuff to Meteor to React Native. I have a giant React Native series, basically stressing all of the fundamentals of picking up React Native. And so you can always head to my website, leveluptutorials.com, to see the video, or on YouTube at Level Up Tutorials. Like I said, there's like 900 plus videos. There's a ton of content here if you are a video learner. If you're more of a blog learner, there's not really any written content. So if you learn well over videos, it's a good place to pick some stuff up. So that's a little bit about me. So I'm used to doing a lot of video tutorial content. In this talk, I wanted to talk a lot about basically Flexbox layout and styles in general in React Native. React Native can be really confusing styles-wise if you're coming from a web place. There's all sorts of caveats that you run into, and you'll find yourself frequently wondering why things just don't work, right? There's situations where you try to apply, let's say, a border to a specific object, and that object can't receive a border at all, but another object can, just based on what type of component it is. So one thing that I'll stress is when you're working in React Native, having the docs open literally 24/7, every time you're working on it, with everything you need to know, just to check if we say, let's head out like a view component, because a view component takes different style props than a text component or something like that. So always being sure of what takes what, making sure you hit up this style section of each individual props to figure out what you're actually trying to do is going to save you a lot of time. But this talk is really going to just hopefully cover some of those pitfalls, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the Flexbox layout to start. Now, React Native does everything with Flexbox, and there is some stuff where we have position, like position relative and position absolute, like we do in CSS, but we don't have position fixed. And some of the way that we usually do positioning on the web is going to be quite a bit different. So you're going to have to really learn how to think in Flexbox and think in React Native layout system for everything in a way that's different than from web. So the first thing I wanted to touch on was Flexbox overall. Now, Flexbox, if you haven't used it before, is really just a replacement for the standard sort of like float and flow model that was on CSS before, where you're floating things left, right, taking things out of the document flow. And when we're applying a Flexbox to a container, the children of that container then can flex throughout the entire container. And so it's going to be good to take some serious time to really learn Flexbox. And Flex is easy to learn once you get the hang of it, but if you've been doing CSS a long time, it's going to take some time. So there's 3 key resources I'm going to recommend for learning Flexbox. I'll make all of this stuff in course notes, But really, we have the CSS tricks page on a guide to Flexbox is really the go-to for like cheat sheet for Flexbox. If I ever need to look anything up on how to do anything in Flexbox, this is the place to do it. But as you can see here, we can change the flex direction from row to column so that things flex vertically rather than horizontally rather than vertically. We can have things, this flex property where we have, where is it? Flex grow, where this item can take up a ratio of 2 to 1 for each one of these items. So we can grow things a bit more relative to each other. And then we have wrap where things can go on to a new row. There's all sorts of stuff where you can actually do alignment and everything like that. So we have justify content where we can either make things justify to the start, the end, the center. We can space them out. We can have space around them. And if you're already familiar with these, that's great. We're actually going to be covering some of these over the course of this chat here. So CSS tricks, this is a great place if you need a cheat sheet for Flexbox. If you need to learn Flexbox entirely, I would recommend Wes Boss's course, What the Flexbox. It's quick videos, basically just giving you everything you need to know, goes over some sort of key layouts, and you'll feel pretty right at home with this. And next is Flexbox Froggy, which is a little bit more interesting. This is less of like a here's how to use Flexbox and more of a, hey, here's a game. We need to get these frogs onto these lily pads. How do we do this? We could do it with justify content, and we could do that as in, I think it's just center will do this. I'm used to writing React Native Flexbox right here. So as you can see here, now that I completed that task, it's taking me on to the next hardest one. This is a good way of like actual practical, but sort of not practical examples on how to actually get Flexbox to do what you want it to do. Either way, Flexbox Froggy is a great way to test your skills. What the Flexbox at flexbox.io is a great way to learn Flex, and this CSS tricks is a great way to just reconfirm what you know. Cool. So now that we have that underway, I wanted to talk about some initial examples. What I wanted to do over the course of this was first do a quick basic layout. And I wanted to show you some of my techniques for not struggling within Flexbox. So here I have a really basic component. And in that basic component, let me open up my simulator here. You'll see there's absolutely nothing. That's for some good reason here. But as you can see, we have basically a view with a style of styles.container and two views, box 1 and box 2. And down here, as you can see clearly, box 1 has a background color of blue and box 2 has a background color of red, both of which we're not seeing, even though we have this container with a Flexbox property of 1. Now, this might be confusing. You might be thinking, hey, two boxes, we have a flex of 1, which in React Native, it's sort of a hybrid of what display Flexbox as well as flex grow. You'll be using the flex property to actually relatively make something grow and shrink. We'll show you that in a second here. But this flex 1 right here is basically going to make sure that the children, which is of course just box 1 and box 2, are going to be properly distributed amongst this container. Now, we might be thinking, well, this isn't showing up, but let's actually give this a width of 50. This is box 1. And I can save this. You can see nothing. And I can give this a height of 50. And you can see we do have this blue square now. So your children need dimensions here, but they don't need dimensions here. What if we want this blue box to take up 50% of this height? Well, all we need to do is simply replace all of this stuff with a flex of 1, and I have live reload on. And you'll notice that because the blue box, box 1, has a flex of 1, it takes up the whole area, and box 2 takes up none. So we'll want to come down here and add a flex 1 property to box 2. And as you can see, we now have this blue and red. So this is really going to touch on one of my favorite techniques that I'm sure is nothing original. In fact, I picked this up from a colleague, Ben Schaff, who I've worked with time, who actually started Level Up tutorials with, although he's no longer involved. However, he basically has this semi-brilliant method of, when you're having layout troubles, give everything ugly primary colors. Just the ugliest, default colors, and you can see exactly what your containers are. It's nothing mind-blowing here, but it's something I do. So if you see these really ugly colors through the course of here, I just want to make everything really painfully obvious. Okay, so we now have box 1 and box 2, and there's no height or width or anything given, and this is great. This is really nice for us. But what we want to do here is we actually want box 1 to be, let's say, 75% of the height of this container, right? We want box 1 to be 75%. Now, one thing we could do is we could set, like, in CSS, you might be thinking like, well, we'll just give this a height of 75%. And this is where React Native's layout system can get really frustrating because there's no such thing as percentage-based widths or heights in React Native. So having something 75% height isn't super easy. And what you'll want to do is default to Flexbox. Now, one way we could think of this flex property as sort of a ratio. So let's say if we had 100%, if we were to set this 75 to 25 and save this, you'll see it's now 75% of the height and 25% of the height for the red. But that's not really what we would want to do. We don't want to go around using this flex property as a percentage. You want to think of it more like a ratio, right? So if we were to have this be, let's take, this one's going to take up 3, and this one's going to take up 1, then we get the same thing. Because if you think about it, we just, the fraction here, whatever, 25 over, the fraction essentially equates to the same thing, right? So you want to be thinking of this flex properties as sort of a ratio here. So in terms of using these flex properties as percentages, you're going to have to be thinking of more in terms of ratios rather than percentages, which can be totally different for somebody coming from a web background, right? You're used to thinking in device or viewport height or even percentage-based things. Okay, so as you can see here, if we modify this to 2 to 3, this just gets even more. So as we advance, 3 to 3 is obviously going to be the same ratio, and they're going to be 1 to 1. This is going to be the same as 1 to 1. So this is the very most basic there is for Flexbox. And I would totally recommend coming in here and making something like this with primary colors and really just making different layouts. Okay, so this is as bare bones, as basic as it gets. Let's check out something a little bit interesting. I thought Instagram was a nice place to look because there's a few really nice design elements within Instagram that are reused throughout everywhere. So I'm going to fire up another example here. So before I get into this, I wanted to actually check out some layouts here. So Instagram has a couple of layouts. We have this grid layout, and we have this main sort of login layout. And these are going to be two very common layouts, to have something like everything sort of vertically centered here with some inputs and login. Obviously, if you're having a login system, you want to make that easily accessible. Right in the center is a great place to do that. And this is the first layout I wanted to check out. We're going to do a really simple version of this, but something that you should be able to see. So I want to take some time to sketch this out, right? So we have our Instagram. I'm just going to sketch here. And I typically would do this on pen and paper just to really get a handle on things, to essentially just sketch out the different ways it should look. So if you think about it, we had the logo, we had a text input, we had a text input. Actually, let me just duplicate that. And then we had a button. And then if you remember, another component was this don't have account. Basically, everything's pushed to the center here, except for this language and this don't have an account. So let's check out, we also had essentially this bottom section down here. This doesn't have to be perfect, just a sketch here. But as you can see here, this layout is sort of generally what it looks like. Now, we might be interested to know that when you initialize a new React Native project, it essentially does half of this for you. When you initialize a new project, it basically sets up a container where everything is to the center. So let's head to the code here and actually get started coding. Okay, so I have a view with styles.container. Inside of that is a text that just says I'm a logo, and then we have two text inputs here. And as you can see, it's all just hanging out here. Two text inputs and I'm a logo. So let's actually get going with this by first centering everything. Now to do that, hold on one second. Now to do that, we basically just need to head to our container. And we want to give the container a flex property of 1. And that's essentially just going to make, it's going to make the children allow this to flex in here. Now we're going to want to give this a align items. So we're going to say align items. Now keep in mind, between React Native and CSS, instead of using hyphenated things, you need to use camel cased for your properties. And when you're using actual definitions here, we need to put everything in strings. So center. So align items center. And that's just going to make sure our items within the container are centered within the container. But what about the container itself? We want the container itself to be centered. So we're going to say justify content. And we're going to say, again, center. Justify content, if you remember, is the Flexbox property that allows us to essentially take all of the children and distribute them amongst the container. Okay, so as you can see here, we now have everything centered. Obviously, in the Instagram example, things were pushed in from the sides, so we can go ahead and give this some padding, just like in CSS. And you'll notice we have, for padding, we have basically a pixel value, but it's a device pixel value. So you don't use percentages, you use numerical values. So here we have padding. Okay, so I'm a logo, 2 inputs with some padding. It's a really super good start. Now, one thing we want to do is we want to add a button here. We want to go ahead and have a touchable highlight, which is essentially what you use for a button. So I'm going to come in here, and actually I already have this code, so I'm just going to copy it so I don't have to type it live. And expand this. And as you can see here, I have a touchable highlight, and inside of that is text. Now, some of the gotchas here are that a touchable highlight, if you want to style the text within a touchable highlight, you need to have text and you need to have style on that text. Let's say if you were to add a color to this touchable highlight, it would complain to you because touchable highlight is considered a view. View doesn't have color. Anytime you're modifying the text itself, you're going to have styles on the text. And I found that personally, it's a little cumbersome and annoying, but you deal with it. So we have touchable highlight now, which if we come down here, simply just has the background color of blue. Since everything is justified to the center, our entire layout adjusts accordingly, and it's centered even though we now have this button in the middle. Now you'll notice that we have this button text. So font size, padding, color, font weight, these are all these are CSS properties that you're 100% used to, right? This is all the standard CSS property stuff. But what we don't have is we don't have this taking up 100% of the width here, which is weird because these inputs both take up 100% of the width. This touchable highlight isn't going to take up 100% of the width. So how do we adjust that? Well, one thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and give this a Flexbox property of align self. So align self. Now, align self is going to basically allow you to align, obviously, the particular element, but we can use a property called stretch. So align self stretch to make this now be the entire width of a layout. And if we wanted the things inside of here to be centered, obviously the button text being aligned to the left is not great. What we want to go ahead and do is say align items, and we'll say center. And now it's centered. Now you might be wondering, well, why didn't you put the align? Why didn't you align the text using text align on the center? Well, to be honest, this text box here, this button text is only the entire width of the button. So, or is only the entire width of the text that you're seeing here. So if we were to give this a text align center, it wouldn't anything, and it would have remained in the far left. So what we needed to actually do was center the component that was button text with align items. So these are just some things that are going to be very different from CSS that are going to make you occasionally flip over your desk chair when you're not able to essentially get them going using the same strategies that you would for CSS. So we now have this button. We now have this logo, and all these inputs and everything like that. But if you remember, they also had this component at the bottom that we talked about, the sort of, if you already have an account, click here box. How would we go about achieving that if we want all of this stuff to always stay centered? Now, there's a few strategies you could use, but for this particular example, it's a great time to use the position absolute that we're so used to in CSS. So if we scroll back up, let's go ahead and add this section here. I'm going to do so inside of my container, and underneath the touchable highlight, I'm just going to add simply a view, and it's just going to have styles of extra details. Now, if we scroll down, let me go ahead and add extra details in here. Because right now, this view isn't going to be anything really. I don't know why my tabbing is so off right now, but just have to deal with it, okay? So because our styles are an object, of course, you always want to make sure you remember your commas here. That'll get you. And now we're going to give this a background color of ugly blue. And we're going to give this a height of, let's just say 40. If we had things in here, we wouldn't need to worry about this, like icons and text and stuff like that. But I just want to have a height here because we're working with just a standard view. And obviously, we don't see anything yet because this doesn't have a width, but we don't want to give it a width. What we want to do is we want to give it a position, and then again in a string. If you're coming from CSS again, you're going be typing the wrong things over and over again. Properties without strings, non-camel case. But what we're going to do is we're going to say, make this be at the bottom. And we're going to make this be at the left. And we're going to make this be right 0. By having left and right of 0, it's going to make it 100% full width. Now, if we come here, you can see that in our layout, this guy is officially positioned at the bottom. So the good thing here is that we have position absolute when we need it. We can take things out of the sort of the flow by positioning them absolutely, giving this width. And we could have done this width a couple of different ways. Like we could have looked at the viewport width and pulled that value out and had it sit this way. However, since we're using position absolute, just having this left and right, we don't actually have to calculate any of that stuff. And we're just left with essentially what is this view here that takes up the entire width. So as you can see, let's compare this to our instant layout. It's obviously not the exact same. It's clearly not as pretty, but what we do have, we have our centered bit, we have our inputs, and if you were to have this extra stuff, this would all get centered as well. And we have this position absolutely. If we wanted to have this thing up top here, it might also be a good case for position absolute. Since none of this stuff is scrolling here, it's all going to adjust to the viewport width accordingly. Cool. So this is basically just the standard layout for a login. Nothing crazy at all. Next, I wanted to talk about a little bit more complex of a layout where we get to do some cooler stuff, which would be something like this. Now, I'm not going to show you all of these little details in here because this is essentially just a view, a view, a view in a flexed row spaced apart. And inside of this container, which is inside of this container, which is also inside of this larger container. What we're going to do is essentially treat this whole top section as its own section and then get into some of this scroll part where we have both this footer at the bottom, we have these icons here, and we're able to scroll up and down. So I guess we can totally skip the sketching this out because I just went over it there. But typically what I would do is sort of look at this and say, okay, this is a view, is an image, but for this example, I'm going to use a view because I just don't want to distract with images. And how do we get this going here? You'll notice that there's 3 up images every single time, and they take up the full width of this window. So one thing that's gone immediately is giving any sort of pixel values for this widths of these items. So let's go ahead and check this out. Let's see. You also want to keep in mind that these are equal width and height. These are all squares, right? So we want the height to always be equal to the width. That's going to be something that's going to come up. So let's head to the curve. Let me minimize that one, and let's fire up this next example. Also, keep in mind, I'm just doing these on the iOS simulator because essentially it's essentially quicker to get up and going. The motion can occasionally be slow, and even then it's faster than the third one. But all of these examples should work on either. Okay, so build this layout from scratch. I have some things going here already. Now, let's head in here, or not that. Let's head to our emulator. And as you can see here, what I already have going is what's this dark gray section would be essentially the top layout. This red view right here is what's going to be one of our images. And we have this icon bar, which is remaining fixed at the bottom here, regardless of when we're scrolling it. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the container. I essentially have wrapping around everything a container. It's wrapping around the scroll view. It's wrapping around everything. Now, this is just a view. And all it has is a property flex of 1. Now, the reason I'm doing that is so that we have one item that's taking up this entire height, right? Next, I have two things. I have a scroll view and another view. The scroll view is going to be the entire scrolling portion, which would be the top section, the profile, all that stuff, as well as the grid of images. Now, we also have what would be the bottom section here. And it might be easy to think this bottom section is similar to the bottom section in the previous layout. So let's position absolute it, let's throw it on the bottom and just have it be there. I mean, the problem with that is it's kind of unnecessary for this layout, but also there's a better way. For instance, we have this container, we have the scroll view, and we have the view, which is the bottom. And let's look at what we're doing. Essentially, the scroll, all it has is a property flex of 1. Now, the bottom section, the icon bar that I'm calling it, because Instagram, it's a series of icons, doesn't have a flex property. In the first video, if two of the children both have a flex property, they're going to take up equal height. So if we apply a flex 1 to this, it's all of a sudden going to be like, hey, I'm taking up the rest of this equal height, and then this thing's getting squished in and not good. But if we don't define this a flex property and we do give this a height, what's cool about this is this layout, the scroll view, will take up all of the height as possible, except for what it can't take up from this. And because it's a scroll view, we can scroll within this view, and this icon bar is always going to stay stationary. So again, the flex 1 is going to make this take up all of the height except for this little bit here. And we don't have to do anything to get it to do that other than defining a height on the bar itself. Now, you'd be wondering, hey, I didn't declare a width ever for this icon bar. How does it take the whole thing? I'm not saying stretch or anything like that. What I am doing is by default, the align, by default, the property that which children will grow is going to be a stretch. So by having this flex of 1 the container, this is going to take up the full width. Likewise, this top section is going to take up the full. Okay, so next we have the top section, which has background color of 333. I just did this to make it sort of just fade away, right? This is just the top section. We have an image grid, which doesn't have files, and an image. The image just has a background color of red. Now I gave a width of 40 and a height of 40 and a margin bottom and a margin right of 2. Now that's going to be more obvious when I add another image. So just by adding another image here, you can see inside of the scroll view, I have the top section with nothing in it, the image grid with now 2 images. And if we head here, you can see that we have 2 40 by 40 boxes that are just coming down here vertically. So that's cool, but like this obviously isn't anything we want. The first thing we want to do is we want this grid to go in a row of from left to right. If you have studied Flexbox, you would know that what we want is a flex direction. We want to apply that to the parent, which is the image grid. So we can come down here to image grid and apply a flex direction. Did you notice how I just typed a hyphen there? That's like it's just drilled into my fingers here. Okay, you can type in flex direction of row. Now, obviously, they're going to be in a row. That's great. But what we want them to do is we want them to take up more, right? We want to take this whole thing. One thing we could say is flex of 1, like this. And you'll notice nothing going on here. And we'll want to go ahead and essentially start setting the widths of these images. Now, there's a few ways we could do this in an interesting way. Because we want these to be perfect squares, right? We could always come down here to these images, and we could give these images a property flex of 1 and watch them fill up this entire space. But that's clearly not what we want, and not to mention the height and width no longer proportional. So let's check out what we can do. Now, one thing we can do, we can import dimensions. Dimensions is part of React Native that allows you to get the viewport dimensions. And go ahead and let's scroll down here. And I put this down here by the styles just so we could see it. But essentially what we're doing is we're setting the variables height and width to dimensions.getWindow. With that, we're now able to get the pixel dimensions of width. So having the pixel dimensions of width, we use that variable in our styles here, right? I mean, it's very different from CSS or even, CSS with preprocessors, but we can now use this variable, right? So we can come in here and say width, and we can set this to the viewport width. Now, let's go ahead back to our thing, and you'll notice it's taking up the whole width. Now, we don't want it to take up the whole width. What we want it to do is take up 1/3 of the width, if you remember from this. So we could always say divided by 3. And let's head to our emulator, and you can now see it's taking up 1/3. Now, I'm going to do this outside in another variable here. So we can just say grid is equal to, and then width of 1/3, or the current width divided by 3. So let's grab this width here and set it to width. Now, if we save that, we should see the same thing. And again, we wanted this to be an even height. So the height is now going to be also set to grid if we set that there. And now the height is set to 1/3 of the width. If we add another image here, there we go. Let's go ahead and add in another image, because obviously Instagram has a ton of images. And you can see this is where our current solution breaks a little bit. If we scroll down here, we can see that we have 4 items in here. But what it's not happening is basically it's not going on to the next line. And since all of these have a fixed width, there's no room for the last one. So in the container, we're going to want to go ahead and add flex wrap. So flex wrap. And then that is just going to be a property of wrap. The options are wrap and no wrap. Default is no wrap. And now it's wrapping, but we have this grid where, if you remember, we had the issue of, we set some margin, right? We said, hey, margin 2 for each of these. What we really want is the width of each of these to be 1/3 minus 2 to accommodate this margin. So if we come in, we can just modify this a little bit here, and -2. And here we have our grid. Now, again, we have some issues here with some. Let's go ahead and adjust that. And we can do that with a justified content of space between. So on the flex grid, we can say, hey, give us some space between. And let's get rid of the margin right, because we no longer need it, because the width is correct. And now what we have is, actually, I think the math might be a little bit wrong. We have 3 items here. Either way, the spacing's not entirely 100%. But what we have here is now a grid of images that will grow from row to row, always take up from width to width, border to border, and we add 100 more of them, it's going to fill out this scroll view. So let's copy all these, add a whole bunch of them. And let's scroll down here and let's check out our layout now. So what's great about this layout is that our icon bar is stuck at the bottom here, even though we have all those red ones. And as we scroll, this takes up the remaining space. So what we have is a scroll view where you can scroll entirely with it, have all of these images as per their grid and the icon bar here. So what we have here is a pretty standard layout, right? You have this grid. I mean, you could probably see this all over the place. An image grid. You could have this top section and you have something sticky to the bottom and you're not using your standard CSS tools. So this is certainly something that is going to take getting used to, because by default in the web, you add something, it scrolls, right? And here we need to make sure we have this scroll view, which is essentially a container that allows for scrolling. Everything inside of that will just allow you to scroll. And based on the flex properties, it will take up the height or width that it's supposed to. Super cool. So these are basically two really key layouts because it covers a lot of stuff, right? We get to use the dimensions of the page in this along with Flexbox. And you get to see that you have access to doing actual JavaScript in your styles that allow you to essentially change the properties in real time with whatever you're doing. So it's very powerful and there's a lot to dig into, but you're also going to find a ton of situations where something doesn't fill up or doesn't show up, and it's just simply a matter of having the wrong properties on it. So basically, the main advice I can give you is if stuff is not showing up, just start giving it primary colors and after that, give it a height and a width. If you see it as a height and a width, a primary color, then you'll know that something's weird about it. In addition, you can also add just a border, a solid border to views to see their boundaries, because sometimes you might think that an item is taking up the entire width when it's really the parent that's taking up the entire width and the child itself is not. And that can also be another sort of frequent gotcha. So basically, what's going on is that you're going to want to, one, nail down your Flexbox foundations, right? You're going to want to learn Flexbox. Now, the problem with paying too close attention or getting too wrapped up in Flexbox here is that's different, right? We have display flex and we have flex grow, where in React Native we just have flex, right? But for the stuff like flex direction, wrap, justify content, those things are going to be the things that you're going to want to really ingrain into how you think about Flexbox. Okay, so so that's pretty much it, right? We have these layouts, we have Flexbox. Like I said, you're going to want to make sure you have your documentation open constantly. And one thing I have noticed is that I think native docs have recently pointed this out, that their documentation is starting to get a little bit better. But historically, this has all been pretty bad and pretty hard to parse. So I'm glad that they're now showing you some really key examples, and they're going to be telling you about some gotchas here, right? Like the default for Flexbox, flex direction in CSS is row, but in React Native, it's column. So just stuff like that. So you're going to want to really dive into these docs. You're going to want to make sure you look at the style properties that are available to you. But in the end, you're just going to want to experiment with it and try to recreate some of your favorite app layouts. And there's most likely going to be tons of solutions to how you can fix that layout, how you can create that layout. And that doesn't mean that your initial incarnation of that layout is going to be correct, and be a great experiment to just get you familiar with the layout. Because if you're coming from a CSS world, it is going to be a somewhat difficult transition to make sure everything is exactly how you'd expect it to be. Cool. So with that said, head to the Level Up store here. It's just store.levelup tutorials. I have a nearly 10-hour course on React Native. And this basically teaches you everything from getting set up to even using in both iOS and Android, right? So all of the examples are shown on both iOS and Android. I show you how you can set up your emulator to correctly use Google services, which is something that actually is way harder than it should be. But we also pull in information from an API. We work with layout. We do some Flexboxing. We work with a little local database using Run. And then I get into platform-specific layouts and components. Now that's talking a lot of material design and the human design guidelines. Now I wanted to have a quick note on those as well. So the React Native human design, or is it, I think it's human design guidelines, whatever the Apple design guidelines are, as well as the material design guidelines, it takes care of quite a bit of stuff for you. Like if you're adding a switch, React Native is going to use the native component for that. So the guidelines should be there. But if you're creating a list item full of things, you'll want to make sure you actually create the human interface guidelines here. And you'll want to make sure that you do understand the correct spacing and the correct padding. And to be honest, there's no great libraries to do this stuff for you from what I found. I mean, there's libraries, but even with the material design, there's no great libraries to do it for you. In fact, most of the time, I would almost recommend coding the styles yourself. For instance, we have React Native Material Kit, which is pretty much the main React Native material design guidelines. There's like 4 or 5 of them, and most of them aren't being currently developed. And even then, most of them are very incomplete. So rather than struggling with an incomplete package, it's not too difficult to code these buttons yourself. It's not going to be too difficult to make this layout. So I would definitely encourage you for when things that aren't like maybe like a spinner, but like an actual material design based layout, instead of using a package, to come in here and code it yourself with this. Chances are you'll, because all of these packages are different and incomplete mostly, you'll have less trouble with it. But as you can see here, this one is Xthink React Native Material Kit. If you're going to use one of them, this is probably the one to use. It has a handful of components. The other ones are mostly broken at this point. But yeah, so make sure you're looking at these design guidelines for both of the interfaces, and basically you should be set with either material or human interface design guidelines. Cool. So I'll leave this last little bit open for questions if anybody has any. All right. Also, sorry, real quick, I should mention, if you're interested in the React Native course that I have here, I'm going to be having a coupon code of Crater. I'll make that available directly following this talk. It's not, if you try to buy it right now with Crater, it won't work, but I'll have it be for 30%. So if you want to take advantage of that, I'll post that in the Slack chat and everything like that when it's up and running.
And now a brief word from our sponsors before you see the rest of the talk. Raygun. Spend more time building great software and less time fighting it. Raygun helps keep a watchful eye on your web and mobile applications and tells you when problems arise. You can learn more at raygun.com. NativeScript, backed by Telerik by Progress, is an open source framework for building truly native mobile apps with TypeScript and Angular 2. Use your web skills to get native UI and performance on iOS and Android. Enjoy the rest of the talk. Awesome. Well, thank you for the talk, Scott. It was very informative. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, it looks like we do have quite a few questions here, so we'll get through as many as we can. Are there any layout debugging tools, this is from Ryan, available? It is so powerful on the web to just be able to right-click and inspect anything and find out what's wrong.
Yeah, that is something that I haven't found the tool there, which is why I to essentially giving things those properties. If we use our Chrome debugger inside of here, if we like debug the JS remotely, it only allows us to debug the JavaScript, right? There's no DOM there for us to debug. So we can't come in here and adjust the styles, which is both frustrating and different. Not to say that there isn't any tools. I'm just not aware of any of them. So at this point, I pretty much just turn on the live reloading. And if I need to start debugging things, just start coding, right? Coding, saving, coding, saving. You'll notice it's pretty fast if you wanted to come in here and do it that way. The live reloading is, or at least for iOS. Android's not as fast, but it's probably getting there. But as you can see, it's like the moment I hit save, it's up and running. So it's pretty good.
I closed your screen share. Sorry.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's okay. But yeah, so either way, that's a suggestion I have: is have your editor open, have your emulator open, and code have hot reloading on, and it's going to update pretty quickly.
All right. So Ryan asked, do you regularly do your dev work in Atom for React Native? Do you use any Xcode for anything other than the emulator?
I use Atom for everything personally. I do that because I code for both Android and iOS, and I don't want to get it into the habit of relying on an Xcode for something when I don't want to have Xcode and the what is it, Android Studio now? I don't want to have Xcode and Android Studio open. So Atom does pretty good, and there's some really good stuff with the nuclei. What is the there's like a suite of plugins that Facebook made. I think it's called Nuclei. Yeah. Those are really, really good, that allow you to have like you can run build commands and stuff from that in React Native.
Nice. All right. So Isaac had a question. What are some best practices for designing layouts in React Native without Zindex, since it doesn't exist?
Yeah, what's funny is that Zindex kind of does exist. Like if you use elevation, which gives it like a shadow on Android, that actually gives it a Z-index. So it's occasionally necessary. But really, the best practices you have to know with stacking order of things is that if something is below it in the code, it's going to be above it in the stacking order. So that might change how you think about layouts a little bit. For instance, if we were to have an image that was like your profile image that maybe sits up top. I don't know if you want to show my screen or something. If you can.
Have to share it.
Okay. Let's see.
There it is.
Yeah. So let's say we had an image that hung out on top of all this information. There's an example that I use in the course of like IMDb, where you have like a movie image that sort of sits on top of everything. That image would have to be in the code below all of these things. It would be below all of the stuff that it needs to be sitting on top of, and then you can position it relatively or position it absolutely with your content and actually physically move it on top of or above these other things. So that's the thing to think about. You're right. Z-index doesn't exist as the same way we're used to in web. So you do have to think about stacking order when you're coding your components. As far as best practices go, I'm sure this stuff's all really young. There's like 1,000 new like style libraries and stuff like that to either help cascading or something like that. There's a lot. The platform is very young. It's fully featured, right? Like you can do production apps with it, but at the end of the day, it's still very young, and there's a lot of new stuff coming out. So I'm sure it's all going to change.
Yeah. All right. So Isaac asked, is there an equivalent to using media queries for CSS in React Native in order to handle multiple device sizes?
That's a good question. I don't know, to be honest. Like to go up to like a tablet layout? Huh. I mean, you could honestly, I don't know if there's a pack. I'm sure there's packages that people have made. I don't know if there's anything natively built in it, but you could always grab the width and check if a width is greater than a certain pixel dimension, then change the layout in different ways. You could use this and have an if statement and have two totally different style objects, or set your styles conditionally based on whether the layout is super wide or super narrow. That's the only thing I can think of off the top of my head. I haven't had to do any different layouts for tablets yet.
Okay. And then this one's kind of related. Ryan asked, you size your squares based on the screen's dimension, but what happens if the user changes their phone orientation? Would the styles be processed automatically? If not, wouldn't your blocks be the wrong size?
Yeah, let's check it out. So we can take this and then rotate left. And as you can see here, they're still using 1/3, right?
Yeah.
So we would want to check that orientation and have that change to be whatever we want it to be, like 1/3 of the height or whatever. As you can see, though, if I refresh, so yeah, there's some stuff in here. That's a good thing to look at. But yeah, these are little things that you're gonna encounter. It's different than CSS.
Yeah. And the last question is from Ryan, what is noticeably missing from the React Native subset of CSS properties?
You know, they did everything for a reason. So I don't think if things are missing, it's because I'm not thinking in React Native land, right? If you're thinking in web land, position fixed is missing, and that's can change how you do things, but ultimately you don't need it with this. But I think that's like sort of the biggest thing. Another thing would be you can add borders to text. You can add borders to views, which you have to wrap your text in views. So you sort of have to think a little bit more of like the properties. Not every property is available for every component. So for me, that's maybe the larger omission, is that you can't use a text component like you could a paragraph or a heading in CSS. You would have to wrap it in what would be the equivalent of a div using a view to be able to apply all of those styles. So that's sort of the biggest omission for me, but I'm sure it's obviously all for a reason, right?
All right. Yeah, I think we'll call it there because we got to get started on the next talk. And I just want to say thank you, Scott. Like, that was very, very informative. And if anyone has more questions, like, feel free to hit Scott up in the chat room or check out his YouTube channel. You have a silver button, right?
I do have a silver button. Yeah, I'm at 140,000 subscribers. So
nice.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. But yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for watching this CreatorConf talk from the Mobile Edition 2016. For more information about upcoming conferences such as the one in February 2017, go to conf.crator.io to learn more.